Greetings, everyone. I'm Mohammad Tawakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to today's session of Rethinking History, Returning to Archives and Documents, featuring Professor Leila Pourtavaf of York University, who will be speaking on Gulistan Harem Histories. The Rethinking History seminar series is co-convened with my colleague, Professor Arzu Azad of Oxford University, in collaboration with the Invisible East program and the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm grateful to Professor Arzu Azad for this joint initiative, regressively due to other engagements. Professor Azad cannot join us today. At the outset, and before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to teach, learn, and live on their ancestral homeland. It is also my pleasure to thank the Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation and Dr. Elahé Mir-Djalali for their generous funding of the Iranian Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Our speaker today, Dr. Leila Pourtavaf, is an assistant professor of history at York University. Her research and teaching stands at the intersection of gender, modernity, and Middle Eastern history. Her writing has appeared in both academic and cultural publications, including American Historical Review, Forthcoming, the Journal of Middle Eastern Women's Studies, Iran-Namag, Insight, Journal of Experimental Media and Art East. She's also the editor of Electronic Feminisms, a bilingual collection of essays that reflect on the history of feminist art and cultural production. Her forthcoming and much anticipated monograph, The Cosmopolis Harem, explores the social, cultural, and spatial dimensions of women's quarter of Nasiruddin Shah's court in the second half of the 19th century. Professor Pourtavaf is also on the board member of a number of associations, including Tawakkoli Archive, that has the honor of having her on the board. And she has been the recipient of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Scholar Award for 2023-2024. Please join me to welcome Professor Pourtavaf. Professor Pourtavaf.
Thank you, everyone. I want to start by thanking Professor Azad and Professor Tawakkoli, as well as Shabnam and Bilal, for all their work putting the series together, as well as today's particular talk. And I want to say it's an honor to speak as part of a series that's hosted so many of my favorite Iranian historians, as well as mentors. So it's a privilege to be a part of this series in particular. And always to be around the generative environment of Iranian studies at University of Toronto. I also want to take a minute to acknowledge that we're meeting today during an incredibly difficult time and in the context of what feels like an unending assault by Israel on the people of Gaza. For many of us, it's been a real struggle to go about business as usual as we experience collective grief over this unfolding genocide. I know many of us feel deeply helpless and disempowered by the current state of affairs, but I also recognize that this has been an incredible moment for global mobilization, for a lasting ceasefire, and an end to the occupation. So I continue to be hopeful that our brief will foster a sense of accountability, solidarity, and action, and will lead to long-term meaningful change and a free Palestine. I'll start with that, and then I'll get to my presentation. Okay, so this presentation is based, as Professor Tavakkoli said, on my upcoming manuscript, the Cosmopolis Harem, but with the goal of offering some reflections on my research methodology in relation to the project. So to kind of fit into the speaker series, I'm going to reflect a bunch about the archives. The book is an elaboration of my dissertation, which I completed in the history department at the University of Toronto in 2018, under the gracious supervision of Professor Tavakkoli, and explores the social, spatial, and cultural dimensions of the women's quarter of Nasir Shah's court during his long reign between 1848 and 1896. I'll start with a brief description of the project, so the larger scope of the project, and then some thoughts on my archival ethos and method. And then in the second half, I'll show some of the results of my research. Some of the results my research yielded. I'm going to focus on one specific example and kind of show how I got there. So at its peak, Nasir Shah's harem hosted upwards of 2,000 constituents, comprised of wives, children, and female relatives, as well as different classes of laboring bodies, from physicians and translators to court performers, servants, maids, and eunuchs, many of whom entered the court as enslaved laborers from a range of geographic, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. Drawing on a robust collection of Iranian visual and textual archival sources collected over the course of over a decade of research, primarily in Iran, my book explores the late-Qajar harem as a primary homosocial public sphere and the site of various forms of transnational circulation and cultural contact between a modernizing Iran and its interregional global networks. Nasir Shah's harem, housed primarily in the Gulistan palaces and Darun, the interior women's quarter, was the last large-scale harem of an Iranian monarch. By the end of the 19th century, this form of conjugality was increasingly scrutinized as a backward Islamic tradition that had no place in a modernizing era. After Nasir Shah's assassination in 1896, and certainly by the time of the Constitutional Revolution, polygamous unions, which were a prerequisite for large-scale royal harems, were frowned upon by modernist reformers and elite citizen subjects and became increasingly relegated to the uneducated and peasant classes. As such, in studies of Nasir Shah's reign, his harem has often been uncritically assessed or dismissed as an example of an old and outmoded Islamic tradition which was in decline throughout the 19th century, and by the turn of the century was successfully replaced with more modernist forms of heteronormative conjugality embraced by 20th century Persian monarchs and elite citizens. My own research shows that rather than being in decline, throughout the second half of the 19th century, the royal Qajar harem was in fact in a perpetual state of physical and demographic expansion, and was a crucial site wherein tradition and modernity met, intermingled, and sometimes clashed. During this period, the Qajar harem was an important and influential social and public sphere, wherein relations of proximity, affective bonds, intimacy, and kinship ties were a primary engine for the acquisition and exercise of social capital and political power, and often cut through class, gender, racial, generational, and bloodlines, fostering complex forms of belonging. At the time of his death, Nasir is believed to have had a total of 85 living wives and 27 surviving children, all of whom spent a significant portion of their lives in the harem, many producing offspring who made up a smaller sector of the harem population. Aside from his immediate relatives, Gulistan Harem residents included a much larger number of laboring classes. So this included various levels of educators, both religious and secular, performers, laborers, including servants and slaves, and a constant stream of visitors from across the empire and far beyond, including an increasing number of European women, marking his harem as amongst the most heterogeneous spaces of late 19th century. Oops. Throughout the book, I focus on the social structure of Nasir Shah's harem, these various classes of residents, and the different forms of familial and conjugal relations which were a defining feature of the day-to-day life in the harem. The book offers a deep examination of the demographic, topographic, and cultural landscape of the Gulistan Harem in order to argue that the late-Qajar harem is both a unique familial space where power and politics circulate in unpredictable ways, as well as a deeply cosmopolitan space, a laboratory for gendered transnational encounters with modernity. For the sake of this talk, I'll begin with a brief description of my research process and how, where, and why I sought out the social history of this institution, because I think it speaks to some of the key issues that are central to the premise of this particular speaker series, and doing historical scholarship in general about Iran in the present scholarly and political ecosystem. I'll then use one of the specific examples from the manuscript to show my process and research method in practice. So the central question or concern of my manuscript is, what are some of the possibilities that open up in women-dominated homosocial domestic spaces that are a prevalent feature of gender segregation in Iranian society? This is, of course, not unique to the Qajar period and continues to be true to this day. As Nazanin Shahrovni's brilliant work, Women in Place, shows, this is sort of an ongoing kind of question that we can pose. So her work focuses on post-revolutionary. I move back to the Qajar. So I began with the assumption that despite the fact that such spaces are often, though not always, a product of conservative religious, state, and patriarchal tendencies, and have repeatedly come to stand in as the most visibly regressive elements of Islamic and Iranian culture, the everyday experiences of those who occupy such spaces holds unique and generative possibilities and thus warrants serious scholarly investigation. Nasir Shah's harem is an ideal site to historically engage with this question because it's one of the most well-documented and ubiquitous women-dominated spaces of the 19th century, and yet its actual social history is buried under large amounts of politically and ideologically driven assumptions and mythical narratives. The hypervisibility of Qajar women in the cultural memory of Iranians, and really anyone with an interest in the Qajar history, is in part constructed through the multiple representations of them, which have continued to disseminate among a large Iranian and global public to this day. These accounts and images have served as source materials, which have continuously circulated within various cultural registers and popular historical imagination. So here are some examples of it. So in TV shows, most recently, Hassan Tatahi's popular TV miniseries, Jairan. That's kind of based on a take of Nasir Shah's relationship with one of his favorite wives, who died very young. As well as films such as The Last Harem, which is actually currently in production by Iranian-American director Maryam Keshavarz. You might know her from her more recent kind of romantic comedy film, The Persian Version. So this is like a very high budget production that's going to be happening, or that is happening, that's currently being produced. As well as theater. So I use here Bahram Beysai's kind of the renowned Iranian filmmaker and playwright, Paida Funeh. And I think, you know, some of these examples in particular, Paida Funeh, really give this kind of Orientalist idea of harems as these kinds of prison houses that women are trying to escape from. So this is not something that's just circulating in Orientalist narrative. It's very much become part of the popular understanding of this institution. And I think Beysai's work is indicative of that. And then the last image is, of course, Shah Diardian's Qajar series. So many of you are maybe familiar with her. She's a renowned contemporary Iranian artist who kind of does these photographs that restage images of Qajar women. And the work is supposed to be about this kind of clash between the modern and the traditional. So the modern is represented by new technologies here, the ghetto blaster, and the traditional is the Qajar kind of background and outfit. So this assumption that the Qajar women are traditional, the modernity is a surprise. Okay, continuing along that line, in the last decade, there has also been a number of international exhibitions globally that feature representations of the Qajar harem, including most prominently, that feature representations of the Qajar harem, including most prominently harem photographs, but also paintings and ephemera. And of course, if you're familiar with Qajar kind of visual history or art history, you know that this is in part because of Nasir Shah's early love of photography. So we have a lot of photographs of this institution, and then his more general patronage of the arts that gives us this kind of robust visual culture of the period. So all this to say, the Qajar harem is very much part of public popular history of the 19th century of Iran. This stuff circulates in very contemporary ways all the time. The TV show that I was telling you guys about just came out last year, or I guess 2 years ago now, 2023. These multiple representations, however, are in contrast to the absence of scholarly historical accounts of the Qajar harem in the historiography of modern Iran. The most robust scholarly writing in English on this institution is a 30-page introduction to the translation of Taj Saltaneh's memoirs. So that's one of Nasir Shah's memoirs, for those guys who don't know. And the memoir is translated by the Qajar historian Abbas Amunat, who's written the seminal book in Iranian historiography on Nasir Shah's reign. So that's a pivot of the universe. The introduction, however, is noteworthy as amongst the least rigorous scholarly works by Professor Amunat, a scholar who's generally renowned for his historical rigor. So I would say this introduction is actually very counterintuitive if you read Professor Amunat's larger body of work. This is important because in the absence of proper historical scholarship on this institution and the women who occupy it, and who often wrongly stand in for women in the Qajar period more generally, these multiple sites of representation and circulation in the contemporary popular and public spheres tend to rely on ahistorical and stereotypical assumptions in situating images and narratives about this institution. And these are generally drawn from Orientalist sources from this period. So there's actually an over-reliance on European text when narrating the visual images from this period. Okay, so in contrast, my manuscript attempts to write a social history of the harem through a deep reading of 3 categories of sources. The first, most obvious possibly, is published memoirs, chronicles, and travel logs from the 19th century and from 19th century actors who were directly implicated in the Qajar harem and court. I focus primarily on Persian sources and read them both along and against the grain of European and Orientalist scholarship about this institution, as well as some Asian and Ottoman sources. So I give you a sample of them here, but we have a large number of manuscripts from the period, political diaries, kind of daily accounts, as well as travel logs that actually give very deep accounts of this institution. And part of what's interesting is because this institution was, for the most part, though not entirely, forbidden from being viewed by men, most of the actual deep accounts are written by women, although we also have a lot of the political intrigue that happens gets narrated by male authors. So that's one category. And as I said, most of the primary sources from this period that most historians rely on for the historiography of the period has pretty robust writings about this institution that I argue haven't been examined adequately. So the second one, as I mentioned, is this vast body of photographs, maps, drawings, and paintings that offer a robust visual history of the harem and its surrounding environment. And as I said, much of this material circulates a great deal in the public sphere. So these are parts of exhibitions, books, and they're held in archives as well. So they're both in public and also in books. And you'll get lots of samples of these throughout the rest of the presentations. And then, of course, the last category is official records and personal correspondence between members of the court and the harem. So these include things like financial records, visitors' logs, request forms, wills, and many other official and personal letters and documents. And this is the material I find is used and relied on the least in telling the story of the harem. It's the material that's available, but rarely read carefully or relied on to tell the bigger story. So my manuscript relies on a robust collection of both published and unpublished sources from these 3 categories, including print and digital sources, gathered from a number of libraries and archives from both inside and outside of Iran. And there's the list of the main ones I use both inside and outside of Iran. And actually, one of the things I wanted to note is I wanted to just quickly, when noting some of the archival challenges. So the image on the bottom is from the Smithsonian, the image on top is from the Gulistan archives, and just the difference in quality is something I wanted you guys to note before I get to the next section. So obviously, Western institutions are able to maintain this material and offer them in much better quality. So yeah, and then I guess I should say in terms of institutions that are outside, so the Smithsonian is obviously an obvious one, but Women's World in the Qajar, Iran is actually a really important one too, which is a digital archive offered by Harvard University. Those of you who were here last year, Professor Najmabadi presented this project as part of this series. And this project has been very seminal to my work. But I should also say that my project's genesis and timeline coincided and ran parallel with Professor Najmabadi's project. So the digital collection launched a couple of years after my first research trip, but continued to grow and expand during my research period. So there's great synergy there, and the site opened up so many new sources to me and the larger scholarly community and public. So for those of you who don't know, what Professor Najmabadi and her team did was they took a lot of personal collections, primarily in Iran, but not exclusively, and digitized them and made them publicly available. So Harvard doesn't own the materials, but there's a kind of open access digital platform where this stuff is hosted and presented and cataloged in actually very thorough ways. As my friend Nafar Sohrabi recently pointed out to me, this idea of archival abundance, most recently popularized by South Asian historian Anjali Arandakbar, is really the premise of this prolific project led by Professor Najmabadi and her team. So countering this idea that the archival absence and loss, countering the idea that archival absences and loss are fundamental and foundational to histories of gender and sexuality, the project shows that the sources are there, we just haven't examined them. So another important feature of this that I'm going to talk about next is that the archive makes private documents available publicly for digitization, as I mentioned. So a few notes on archives. All of my primary sources were drawn from public collections with significant Persian holdings. So this is the list that you see of the places that I did most of my research from. And this commitment to working with public archives was an intentional act on my part. Early in my research, I encountered a common trend within the historiography of Qajar Iran, which is that many, if not most historians of the period, tend to rely, at least in part, on the use of private, personal, and family collections in their work, with little to no distinction between the politics and practices of working with private versus public records. Of course, the reliance of private collections is in part because of the difficulties of access, censorship, inability to travel, etc. As I learned during my research process, while Iranian institutions hold a robust collection of Qajar materials, they lack in both organizational structure and transparency, and there are some severe limits in terms of public access as well as the quality of the sources. So this is why I wanted you guys to kind of compare the quality of the Smithsonian versus the Gulistan archive. For example, the Gulistan archive does not have a searchable database that's open to the public. Thus, access is limited to what employees allow you to see. The material is at times unreliable and does not have properly cataloged designations, and access is also often dependent on a variety of bureaucratic factors that are hard to navigate and require a great deal of time and patience. This is, of course, not unique to Europe. Doing archival research in most regions of the Middle East poses a series of unique challenges that can be quite different from working within Western institutions. Wars, political instability, authoritarian governments, censorship, and what Rosie Bashir has so aptly called archival wars have all functioned to limit scholars' ability to conduct archival research in each of the region. While some historical depositories have been completely decimated in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, and of course, most recently and tragically in Gaza, others have increasingly become sites of surveillance and censorship. This is an acute problem in a range of locations, including Iran, the Gulf states, and Egypt. So limits to sources does make me sympathetic to the need to pursue private collections. However, I find three major problems with this reliance on sources from private collections, which is rampant in Qajar historiography. And I should remind us again that there is an abundance of Qajar sources in Iranian archives, and they're actually less likely to be objects of political censorship than, say, Pahlavi materials. So the first is that for some scholars, a tendency towards private collections and finding unpublished sources has led to placing more emphasis on the discovery, exhibition, and publishing of such sources, and less on their analysis and historical contextualization. Thus, the tendency to fall back on old and tired Orientalist narratives in situating the sources, and unfortunately, many of the exhibits I listed earlier, along with their catalogs, fall prey to this tendency. The second issue is that many documents which are held in private collections are owned by heirs or entitled parties and shared reluctantly and selectively with general scholars, or sometimes shared with strings attached, and are instead reserved for sale to wealthy collectors and institutions. There's a whole economy of collectors buying papers and photos belonging to notable individuals and hoarding them, working to up their market value for global auction houses, often through the labor of scholars and curators, in order to sell them for inflated prices to various other collectors and major institutions. This can lead to a problematic colluding between dealers and scholars, and unfortunately, Qajar historiography in particular is rife with these kinds of collusions. So rather than a commitment to give public access and democratize the archives, many of these collectors are invested in privatization and monetization. Finally, the third problem is a tendency of individuals and scholars with direct ties to the royal family and the descendants and other elite families of the Qajar period, having privileged access to private collections, which can allow them to hold a monopoly on the historiography of the period and the way it is narrativized. This is, again, a particularly acute problem within Qajar historiography, as two of the main international bodies that hold such a monopoly, the International Qajar Studies Association and the Qajar Family Association, are proudly run by royal family descendants. Within these institutions, members make use of private family collections in order to generate and circulate their own, often favorable family histories. Such works tend to be apologist histories with loyalist overtones and do not constitute critical historical scholarship of the Qajar period that's in conversation with broader transnational debates. So in contrast to all these trends, I chose to only work with public archives for my manuscript, and as an intentional rejection of the elite privatization of knowledge production rampant within Qajar historiography. I limited my work to what was present in public institutions, but what materials parties would willingly donate to such institutions, and found that there was enough sources within publicly accessible archives that, when properly analyzed and contextualized, tell a rich and nuanced gendered history of Qajar political and domestic culture. And again, I want to note the Women's Qajar project is very seminal to this, to my project and to being able to do this. And then I also want to note that much of the material for the Qajar period is not government censored. So a lot of what I'm saying can't apply to the Pahlavi archives, for example, the same way. Okay. So for the second half of this presentation, I'm going to offer a somewhat annotated excerpt from a section of my forthcoming article in the June issue of American Historical Review. The article is titled Gulistan in Black and White, the Racial and Gendered Legacies of Slavery in 19th Century Iran. The article is based on a chapter of my manuscript that examines the social history of the servant class of the Gulistan Harem. So this is a group that is primarily made up of enslaved laborers. The work I'll just start. In a striking photograph taken and captioned by Nasir Shah, the Qajar monarch who ruled over Iran between 1848 and 1896, a large gathering of high-ranking court and harem servants fills the step leading up to the Shah's bedchamber, his khabgah, located at the heart of his harem. The image, likely taken in 1887 at the dawn of the last decade of his rule, is of a small cross-section of a multiracial laboring class who lived and worked in the Shah's residence at Gulistan Palace, and who were a significant part of the larger Qajar royal family structure. According to Nasir Shah's grandson, just Ali Khan Mehmet, there were approximately 90 eunuchs who resided and worked in the Gulistan palace during the Shah's reign. This photo features about 40 of these eunuchs, most of whom played a particularly crucial role as liminal figures in the court and harem life with unique social position. Like other enslaved peoples, these individuals were usually separated from family and community at a young age, trafficked and sold in various slave markets before arriving at the court and its harem. Since they were usually captured at a young age, castrated before entering the slave market, and left with little knowledge of their origins, they were considered kinless and raised, sheltered, fed, and educated inside the palace. Thus, their loyalty to their masters and mistresses was perhaps wrongly presumed to be absolute. This allowed them privileged access to what was deemed to be the most private sphere of the palace, its harem, where they were entrusted with the special duty of protecting, serving, and educating royal women and children. This proximity to power not only allowed for certain kinds of privilege, it also enabled court units to leave robust traces within the Qajar archives, traces that I argue have been largely ignored and understudied within the historiography of the period. So, despite the fact that they appear frequently in this writing and the sources, they are rarely written about or centered as historical subjects. I'm going to offer an account of one of the eunuchs in this photograph as a way to give insight into how I go about retracing the lives of this category of enslaved people as revealed in sources from the period. Such slave narratives are rare within the historiography of modern Iran, but as my research shows, the sources which enable their telling are plentiful, linger in the archives, and deserve further scholarly attention and scrutiny. Aziz Khan is one of the high-ranking eunuchs featured in this photograph who resided in Nasir Shah's palace during the last decade of his reign. He's the white eunuch seated in the front row, third from the right. So it's actually here in this picture, and this is his image. And I first encountered or noticed him because he's one of the handful of eunuchs who appear and is identifiable in several photographs as well as writings. So here are some examples. And again, the quality, I've left them so that these are not touched up images there as I got them from the archives. So he is here, and then, sorry, the image is very small on my screen, but I think he's like around here in the second image. And in these images, there's writing underneath it that kind of identifies him. So he's one of the high-ranking eunuchs featured in the original photograph who resided in Nasir Shah's palace during the last decade of his reign. Sorry. And sorry, I already said that. The other thing I wanted to say is one of the things that's noticeable about him is that he's also a subject of solo portraits. So here's one. I've found 2 solo portraits. So actually, unlike a lot of other figures I trace in my larger kind of social history project, with him, I actually first encountered him with photographs. With a lot of other individuals, it was actually in the writings from the period, and then I would find photographs of him after, but with him, he appears in a large number of photographs from the period. While we have little information about his childhood or how he entered the Qajar palace during the course of Nasir Shah's reign, we do know that he rose to powerful position primarily through his close affiliation with significant Qajar figures and left archival traces and an afterlife legacy, which offers us historical insight into the possibilities for social mobility opened up to this class of harem constituents. So this class being kind of white in particular in this case, elite eunuchs of the court. It's important to note that such prospects were not readily open to most enslaved people in 19th century Iran, the majority of whom led lives far from power and the luxuries associated with the highest ranking court eunuchs. Yet even despite his high rank status and the several archival traces left behind by this individual, there's few mentions of him in the historiography of the period. So despite his elite circumstances, he's part of a larger forgotten and told history of enslaved people within the historiography of Qajar Iran. This is what Michel Rolfe-Trouillot describes as archival power at its strongest, the power to define what is and what is not a serious object of research and therefore of mention. Tracing the history of Aziz Khan is thus an attempt to address the silences about and the absences of enslaved and formerly enslaved Qajar servants from the historiography of modern Iran, and in conversation with newer scholarship that takes the history of slavery in Iran seriously. So this includes a very hot off the press recent publication by Bita Zadeh, The Color Black, Enslavement and Erasure in Iran, which just came out this month actually with Duke University. So let's get to Aziz Khan's story. As I said, Aziz Khan's a white eunuch, renowned and admired for his physical beauty, physical appearance, and belonging to Aisha Khanum. She's one of the Shah's temporary wives, his CIS. While we know little about his early life, he most likely entered Nasiruddin Shah's court as an enslaved and castrated young boy, a ghulam bache, from the Caucasus region, sometime during the later part of the first half of the Shah's reign, though he mainly appears in the sources during the last decade. And I can't tell you how much time I've spent actually looking at group photographs of ghulam baches. There's a lot of them, but they're often not named. So I've been trying to figure out where he would be in the kind of earliest photographs. And this is where maybe AI could help me at some point. I haven't been able to locate younger pictures of him yet. So he makes his first appearance in Etemad Saltaneh's Chronicles on February 5th, 1888. Etemad Saltaneh writes, quote, Amina Sultan wishes to visit the house of Aziz Khan, one of the Shah's young and beautiful Khoshro eunuchs. Since this eunuch is the object of love, Esh, of the prime minister, he's using the excuse that he's visiting Mirza Hassan, whose house is attached to Aziz Khan's house. Mirza Hassan is deeply confused. End quote. Aziz Khan's ascent to power can be attributed to his close and intimate relationship with Amina Sultan, a significant courtier and Nasiruddin Shah's last prime minister, who was himself the grandson of a Georgian slave, and whose fondness for the young eunuch is the subject of much court gossip. Both local and European sources generally link Aziz Khan to the prime minister, with a specific focus on his alluring physical appearance. Amina Sultan's chief rival, the high-ranking court official and pro-Western reformist, Amina Dole, for example, offers a colorful account of the prime minister's, quote, love for one of the eunuchs of the harem. In his political diaries, he writes, quote, the prime minister was found with one of the harem eunuchs, whose face was beautiful like the moon, whose hair locks grew like hyacinths, whose cheeks were bright like flowers, and whose chin bore soft and defined lines. His delicate figure made the conditions ripe for intrigue. The poor soul Amina Sultan was captivated and charmed. He could not hide his affections or maintain discretion, since there's no patience in an eager heart. He went from looking to touching. The suggestion here is, of course, that the prime minister was in fact engaged in an illicit affair with the young eunuch servant, captivated by his physical appearance. So this is in fact a queer history. Much like descriptions of white enslaved women who are often taken as concubines, Aziz Khan's features adhered to racialized and gendered beauty standards and were revered with light skin complexion and a delicate figure as key markers. The French court physician, Verrier, gives the following account. He is tall and slender with dainty fingers, a pale complexion, and a white face. Though he is 30 years old, he gives the appearance of a very young girl. He was often mistaken for a woman wearing man's clothing, but he is in reality a eunuch in the royal Andarun, lent out by his mistress to Amina Sultan. As Ferrier notes, Aziz Khan's slave status meant that he was considered the property of the Shah's wife, Aisha Khanum, but unknown to the prime minister in this case. It was not unusual for enslaved servants of the court to be lent out, gifted, or sold by their masters and mistresses to powerful court figures in order to gain favor. As I note in my larger project, being the object of sexual desire of elite men allowed white enslaved women access to powerful positions within the court, and with some becoming significant wives of the Shah and mothers to royal descendants. I should mention in the larger project and in the larger essay, in fact, I deal with the racial logic which prevented Black enslaved people the same access points to power. So I don't do that in this, but I'm just going to focus on him. But race is a very important feature of how Aziz Khan navigates his social status. In this case, both desirability and access crossed the gender line and were extended to Aziz Khan, who transcended the characterization of eunuchs as asexual bodies, a characterization that was key to their presence in the harem. Etemad Tantaneh increasingly expresses his disapproval of the illicit relationship between the two over the coming months. For example, on the evening of September 12, 1888, he attends an annual Ramadan ceremony at Amin Sultan's private residence. Etemad Tantaneh describes the prime minister, quote, with a turban around his neck, being playful and flirting with Aziz Khan in front of 5,000 guests. I was in shock and grieved the state of our government, end quote. Much like other high-ranking eunuchs, Aziz Khan was also able to leverage his role as intermediary between the harem and its outside world to gain favor. Amin-ud-Dawla suggests, for example, that Amin Sultan used Aziz Khan as an informant to gain knowledge of the Shah's personal life and private affairs. In fact, Aziz Khan was eventually caught for spying in the harem, and as a result was ejected from the palace by Nasir Shah in 1889, losing his position within the court and its harem. His intimate relationship with the prime minister, however, continued and actually led to him relocating to Amin Sultan's private residence in the aftermath of his eviction, where his power and influence only grew. In fact, much to Etemad Tantaneh's dismay, and despite having been evicted from the court, Aziz Khan accompanies the prime minister on Nasir Shah's third and final tour of Europe in the same year. We have images. So this is a trip that was very well documented, not just by Etemad Tantaneh, who went along, but also in several diaries, but also in photos and various textual accounts. This is an image from the Tehran University, and I just wanted to note that the way that this image is cataloged in Tehran University, Aziz Khan is the only person who's not named in the image. So the image notes Amin Sultan is sitting there, Sahin Iftiar, who's Ghulam Hussein Afghari, who's a Qajar courtesan who went on to become a minister of war during Muzaffar bin Shah's reign. He's standing, and then we have Mirza Hassan Mustafi al-Mamlek, who's the aristocratic statesman who's seated beside Amin Sultan. He also went on to become Nasir Shah's Grand Vizier, and later served as prime minister for several terms after the constitutional period. And then you also have Joseph Toulouzan, who's a European man on the far left. He's a French physician who served in the Nasir court for a period of time. So, as I mentioned, everyone is named except him. And I want you to reflect back on Trio and kind of the archival power of naming and not naming as a way of determining who is and is not worthy subject of study. So this titling is based on the Tehran University's cataloging. So it's not something that came automatically with the photograph. And once I kind of figured out who Aziz Khan was and kind of could place him in different places, then studying those periods, those trips gave me access to sources that then showed he was very much present in all of these instances. So he's there in Europe. So throughout the trip, Etemad Tantaneh is consistently irritated by the nature of the prime minister's relationship with Aziz Khan on the tour. On one occasion, he describes the two taking a 3-hour-long bath together. At another point, he notes that during the trip, the two sleep in the same room each night, confusing their Russian hosts. Etemad Tantaneh describes the behavior of the prime minister and Aziz Khan as having brought disgrace to Nasir Shah and his entourage amongst their European hosts. By the time of Nasir Shah's assassination in 1896, Aziz Khan had transformed into a powerful figure with considerable influence and wealth, and the prime minister's right-hand man. Although Amin Sultan was briefly dismissed as a prime minister in the wake of Nasir Shah's assassination and exiled to Qom, he returned to the post in 1898 and served under the title during the reign of the next two Qajar monarchs. sources continue to center the intimate relationship between Amir Sultan and Aziz Khan, suggesting their relationship lasted throughout the duration of this period and until the prime minister's own assassination in 1907. For example, Mirza Hussein Khan, a mid-level cleric officer who kept a personal diary, writes of a trip to Qom Amir Sultan takes, accompanied by Aziz Khan during Muzaffar bin Shah's reign between 1896 and 1907. In it, Mirza Hussein Khan describes Aziz Khan as the prime minister's object of desire, taraf male, and in charge of all his affairs, Hana Farash. And here's a photograph I found of them in Rome, dated 1897. And so this is, again, Amir Sultan. This is his entourage going to Rome. And behind him, it's all of his children with Aziz Khan standing. It's almost, if you take, this is a very interesting photograph, and I have a lot to say about it, but I won't. But one thing I want to say is if you just take this section of the photograph, it actually looks like a family photograph. So it looks like Aziz Khan is, you know, Amir Sultan's mate, and then he's standing with their sons. Of course, it's not his son, he had a wife, but in the photograph, the composition kind of suggests that. Even after Amir Sultan's own passing in 1907, Aziz Khan continued to accumulate wealth and live a lavish life, becoming one of Tehran's most prosperous landowners through the reign of the last two Qajar monarchs. It's during this period that he leaves his most robust archival trace in government documents, most often now called Nusrat al-Mamlek. So this is another thing. A lot of these figures have different titles, so you kind of have to search based on various titles that they get at different points in their life. Amongst the most fascinating of these is the reference to him in a 1909 letter from the Ministry of Finance addressed to the Foreign Affairs Office. Aziz Khan is named as one of several individuals who have refused to pay taxes due to their foreign status. The letter states that Aziz Khan seeks exemption from paying taxes due to government-based claim on, he's exempt from paying taxes to the government based on claims of Russian citizenship. To explain this request, a bit of historical context. Throughout the 19th century, of course, Russia has consolidated power over Central Asia and annexed much of the region from Ottoman Empire and the Qajar dynasty. The Caucasus was indeed then Russian territory by this point, and Aziz Khan's self-identification as a Russian subject, rather than a formerly enslaved Caucasian eunuch, allowed him to claim his background as a source of tax relief in the aftermath of the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which placed northern Iran, including Tehran, under Russian sphere of influence. So Russians in these regions were exempt from paying taxes. Thus, rather than his formal slave status being a marker of subjugation, Aziz Khan's cunning diplomacy vis-a-vis the current geopolitical situation allowed him to make claims about his slave origin as a site of privilege to Russian citizenship. By the end of his life, Aziz Khan had accumulated a formidable amount of wealth. Court records suggest that his claims to both land and tolls he collected on his properties, many of which were located in the northwestern parts of the country, in places like Zanjan, Ismailabad, and Irajabad, were often contested, with several complaint letters against him directed at the Ministry of Justice, corroborating descriptions of him as a tyrant landlord. The middle is an example of that. And there's so many of them, so there's actually a whole file of complaint letters about him as a landlord. A detailed outline of his holdings can also be found in his will written in October of 1923. Aside from huge land holdings, the document also lists a large sum of silver and gold coins, jewelry, weapons, equipment such as telescopes purchased during his European tour, musical instruments including pianos, important paintings, calligraphic works, and much more. Aziz Khan's afterlife legacy can in part be traced to sites of knowledge production in modern Tehran. Oh, I should mention, again, this is, there's about 2.5 decades of debates over his assets that are in the archives by various actors. So Aziz Khan's afterlife legacy can in part be traced to sites of knowledge production in modern Tehran. This includes his extensive collection of manuscripts, printed books, and maps, which were donated to the Royal Library and went on to become one of the initial seed collections of the National Library of Iran when it opened in 1937. Income generated from Aziz Khan's vast properties also became part of an endowment which funded one of the largest orphanages in Tehran, Dar al-Yatam Shahpur, housed in his own former residence, as well as a high school for orphan girls, which is still present in downtown Tehran's Enqilab district. The afterlife of Aziz Khan includes over 2.5 decades and debates and conflicts over his vast assets between various actors, including named heirs, landowners, members of parliament, and even Reza Shah and his successor, Mohammad Reza Shah. Yet few of these records reference Aziz Khan's origin as a young enslaved eunuch and servant of the court. As Bitabaqulizadeh has argued, unlike Black enslaved and formerly enslaved people, white enslaved people were able to transcend their slave status and blend into the urban landscapes of Tehran in the first decades of the 20th century, making use of their privileged status to create better opportunities and conditions for themselves and freedom. This is one of the many ways in which the materiality of race impacted the life chances of enslaved and formerly enslaved populations in Qajar. High-ranking slaves like Aziz Khan, who served in Nasir Shah's court and harem, were rarely born into their rank. More often, they entered the court after being captured and sold into the Qajar slave trade. The long and complex history of slavery in Iran and the central role it increasingly played in the region's trade in the second half of the 19th century begs a more robust historiography, one which is beginning to emerge in recent years. My larger essay is part of this emerging field of study, and this excerpt offers a historically specific case study of slavery in the court and harem of Nasir Shah, a significant patron of the institution in late 19th century Iran, as revealed through a close reading of an abundance of archival sources.
Thank you, Professor Pourtavaf, for your brilliant and illuminating presentation. Now we have time. Would you be able to entertain some questions? Yes. Any questions? Hands up. Please raise your hand, your digital hand, or yes, Dr. Moshiri, please.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is whether this race dichotomy between white slaves and black slaves was something that continued throughout Qajar dynasty, or was something legacy of Nasir's period rather than what happened before? And whether there is a comparison between what happened in Qajar court with what happened in Ottoman court, because in Ottoman court, a lot of black slaves who were eunuchs rose to the state of power, and there was no, there was a racial segregation in terms of what you said, but not as pronounced as what happened in Qajar court.
Please unmute.
So yeah, that's a big question, and it is kind of the topic of the larger essay. But what I would say is, yeah, I think the distinction and the kind of marking of Black bodies as in various ways abject predates the Qajar period, but really elaborates or becomes much more acute during the Qajar period. And this is partially because of how abolition happens in the Middle East. So Iran is one of the later places where slavery is abolished. And as the Gulf slave trade or the Indian Ocean slave trade starts to kind of lose slave markets across the Ottoman Empire, Iran actually becomes, places like Lange become key ports for the importing of enslaved Africans. So actually from the kind of 1970 onwards, you actually have this huge proliferation of enslaved Black people coming into Iran. And you really see that in representations of them in Nasir's harem. So there's a shift from primarily white slaves to primarily Black slaves, although both still exist prior to and after. So that's one part of, I guess, answering your question. And then in terms of sort of the way, sorry, the second part of your question was the continuation of this in the post.
No, rather comparison between what happened in the Ottoman court in the same period, basically.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of points of comparison, although I will say the key kind of difference is this timeline, right? Because the Ottoman court actually starts to have less enslaved Africans in the same period that the Qajar court starts to have more. And there's nuanced differences as well, but yeah.
Very good.
So much.
Thank you very much. Shirin?
Yes, I am a bit confused about the term of high rank servant in the harem. When Professor Pourtavaf started her presentation with that term, my assumption was that this group of servants, they are just they were in the service of the queen and princesses, and then there are other servants that they are going to the lower rank of the harem's women. Or this term is applied only to some people like Aziz Khan. If it can be clarified that.
Very good. Good question. Professor Pourtavaf?
Yeah, so I mean, I use it more broadly, I guess, because eunuchs in general, most of them were higher ranking servants in the court and harem because of this liminal status that they had that I talk about. Within that, there's higher ranking units, and they had titles that identified that. So, Ehtaram Haram was very high ranking, and Aziz Khan, in fact, doesn't start out as very high ranking, but he becomes a very high ranking figure through negotiations of various kind of personal relations. But in general, the image that I started out with the court eunuchs, primarily court eunuchs sitting on the steps, most of those are high-ranking units. Their placements kind of in front of the khabgah suggest that, their outfits suggest that they are high-ranking servants in the court, which is a complicated term, right? Because they are also, many of these are products of the slave trade. Many of them are still enslaved. Some of them gain manumission while they're in court, others not till after. One of the documents I've actually found that I know exists out there. So a lot of the stories of individuals that I kind of try and trace, it's like there's a lot of missing documents. There's a lot of missing things in there. So I actually haven't found any manumission documents for Aziz Khan, but it's clear that that happened at one point, and I'm sure that document exists. I just haven't been able to find it so far.
Just as part of the
so
same...
this term doesn't apply to female.
Sorry? I didn't hear.
I was asking, so this term doesn't apply to female servant.
You also have high-ranking female servants, so they would be the confidants of major figures. You also have a lot of the most important, so Iran, like under Nasir and Shah, we don't technically have a queen, but the de facto queen is the favored wife is Anis-ud-Dawla. Generally, that's what people think. There's a few of them. So there's Amin Abbas, there's Anis-ud-Dawla. Most of those women actually enter the harem as servants or slaves. So they become very high-ranking figures, but you also have high-ranking female servants. So confidants of Anis-ud-Dawla, for example, Munis-ud-Dawla, who writes her memoirs during the Pahlavi era, is a high-ranking servant. A lot of the rank is associated with kind of their placement in relation to who they serve.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next question is from Houman Razavi, please.
Thank you, Dr. Tawakkoli, and thanks for the presentation. Very unique research studies. The question that I have is that you brought up the challenges that you face in terms of your archival access and use of archives. Did you ever run into the issue that there were conflicting accounts or pieces of evidence on characters that you were trying to investigate? And if that's the case, how did you try to come up with the best interpretation of those conflicting evidence?
Yeah, so much conflicting evidence, lots of footnotes and lots of kind of finding multiple sources. So, you know, my first kind of, once Azizman is a good example, I'll use him because I've told you guys all about him. So I see this guy in a bunch of pictures, and then I see he's all over Etemad Saltaneh's diaries, but a lot of Etemad Saltaneh's descriptions of him are very kind of venomous and really about Amir Sultan. So it's this, he's really resentful. So, you know, accusing illicit relationships could be a reflection of that resentment. But then I saw that, no, this actually appears in a multiplicity of sources and then so much photographic evidence. So it's about kind of building your case. I mean, the thing I will say about the kind of archival work that this kind of project requires is it's slow. It's like a lot of, you know, it's been years that I've been kind of finding stuff, and I still find stuff about him. So as I was saying, you know, I have a current research assistant who's in Iran, and I've been like, go try and figure out if you can find the manumission document for him. It must exist somewhere. I'm 100%, 95% sure that it's somewhere. But so yeah, it's accumulation. It's a process of accumulation. So patience. Slow.
Thank you. The next question is from Azra Gandaharian. Please.
Thank you very much for your intriguing. Are you hearing me? Thank you
Yes.
very much for your intriguing presentation. My question is related to the materiality of gender and the mobility of class that you have already elaborated on that. But I mean, is that basically gender-wise? Like that first we got the male slaves, then eunuchs, then the concubines, I mean, then confidants and then concubine, like male-female related issue, or that was basically related to who they served? And my second question is the conflicting data that you found. Was that, did you deliver any sort of critical analysis on that you found this conflict basically because some parts of the narratives want to be, I mean, shown in a different way so that we would have a different understanding of a person? Or was that basically racial issues? Was that a power struggle or anything like that? Or if you can introduce me any other article or literature that I can study talking about the conflicting power discourses, I would be more than grateful. Thank you very much.
I'll start maybe with the second part, and I might get you to repeat your first question because I'm not sure I understood what you meant, like something about materiality of gender, but I'm not sure what the question was. So in terms of kind of the conflicting narratives and how I deal with them, the last chapter of my manuscript, perhaps the most boring chapter of my manuscript, is my attempt to do that. So what I do is actually go through some of the main manuscripts that I use for this. So not all of them, but a significant number of them, including Etemad Saltaneh, and I try and situate each of those writers and their work in conversation to the context that they were presenting. So part of what I'm arguing is that they each are invested in representing a certain version of the harem. So this is not just kind of neutral, objective knowledge about the institution. It's very much framed through how they view. So do they see this as a backwards institution, or is it part of their kind of normal landscape of how gender relations should be? And there's a lot of differences between the various authors. So I try and do that kind of work in the last chapter of my manuscript, where I actually kind of engage with the perspective of various actors who left the robust narratives about the harem and kind of try and offer insights into their positionality in relation to the topic as a way to also kind of reflect on my own kind of investment in this institution. So, you know, Orientalists also had an investment in this kind of institution. There's a reason why a lot of European writers were very obsessed with writing about these kinds of institutions. It fed a larger kind of social and political needs. So I try and apply the same kind of analysis to each of the main writers that wrote during the period. And then I'm sorry, could you repeat your second question about the materiality of gender? Other than, Yes,
Thank you
Jen.
very much. Yeah, that was the first question was, well, thank you. Let me paraphrase it in a way that the mobility of class in the slaves or the people who are like inferior, is that basically a gender issue, or that was the issue of a power issue? I mean, who they served, which helped them to have a higher position in the society, or that was because one was male, the other was eunuch, so between male and female, or the other was female?
Yeah, it's much more complex than that, I would say. So in this instance, it's of course gender, sexuality, intimacy, and race. All of those play a role with Aziz Khan, and in a way, all of those play a role in different figures that I follow. So that doesn't mean that Black enslaved women didn't rise to prominent position, but their avenue was limited due to the materiality of race, if we want to call race material, which, you know, of course there's objections to that, but Blackness mattered is part of what this article, the larger article, argues. So I actually, in the larger article, do this comparison between Bahram Agha, who's another very significant court figure, who also, by the time of his death, has accumulated a lot of wealth and land. And he's, in fact, an African enslaved person who gets manumission while inside the harem. So for him, his route to gaining this power is very different than Aziz Khan's. It's not through this desirability of his body that he mobilizes. It's actually through cunning negotiations. It's through his relationship with his mistress, where he gets her to trust him more than her own family members, and actually switch a bunch of their assets over to him. So, you know, there's different venues. And what I argue is all of these categories, race, class, intimacy, they all play a role.
Just as a part of the same question, did Aziz Khan have special skills that had to do with managerial skills that really enabled him to move up, but also to be able to accumulate a great deal of wealth later in life? Without those managerial skills that must have been unique.
So in the early phase of the archival traces he leaves while he's in the harem, it really feels like most of his access is because of the way he looks. But obviously he's navigating that, right? So he's not unaware of how to navigate his physical presence and appearance. But certainly in the later section, so when he becomes Hamdi Sultan's right-hand man outside of the court, then absolutely his managerial skills are important. As I said, there's a whole series of documents that are actually complaint letters about him, including one from actually, Etemad Saltaneh. So Etemad Saltaneh actually loses property to him at one point and complains about it. So he's actually described as a sort of tyrant. None of these are self-representation. So again, in doing slave history, you have to also kind of think about what are the traces that they are leaving that's self-representing, and what are the traces that we're kind of reading in the archives that are about them and the differences. And so keeping all of that in mind as a bracketed thing, definitely he seems to be very good at finances. He's able to accumulate a vast amount of wealth. I mean, I was quite shocked when I kind of saw the listing of all of his assets that gets debated. So the folder that exists, that's like the debates about his assets after he dies, is like 70 pages of literally debates for years, decades, 2.5 decades about. So he definitely has some managerial skills, I'm sure.
Thank you much. The next question is from our colleague, Jane Lewison. Please, Jane.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just wondering, of course, when we think of slaves in North America and the Caribbean, we're thinking of agricultural slaves. And these all seem to be household slaves you talk about. Were there agricultural slaves also, or was it they just haven't been, documented?
Yeah, there were some. It's not the main way that enslaved populations were used as laborers within the Qajar Empire, but there were some. And I think Matthew Hopper, who's written a book that's kind of about pearl divers. So in the Gulf region in particular, there were more agricultural workers, but in Tehran, the majority of them were domestic workers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then next question from Dr. Azam Khatam. Dr. Khatam, please.
Thank you very much for your really interesting work, for sharing with us in this session. My question goes back again about the social mobility of the slaves in the country in that period. I know that you are focused on slaves that are working in the harem, but is it, do the other people have the chances to buy lands? I mean, especially on the ownership of the land and asset which comes as land. Was it really for all those people who working and have those close relationship with the elites to be able to buy land? I mean, it is not only the legal aspect or the finance aspect, but also the status of the people who could be categorized as landlord. It seems to me a bit strange because when I went through the Abdul Ghaffar, status, when he tries to use the land ownership, he actually ascribes it to a very small group of people, and Kanizan and Ghulaman are not among them. So it was really interesting to see that he could buy the land. From when he was able to do that, and was it, a chance common among his, ranks or not? Thank you.
So the second part of that question is actually what I think Professor Tavakkoli would like me to look at more, because the Tavakkoli Archives has a whole bunch of early 20th century land registries. So it is a project that is kind of out there to kind of trace names from inside the court who then move outside the court and become landowners. So I'll maybe offer a more broad answer, but the specifics, I haven't done that research yet. Maybe Professor Tavakkoli can speak to it. So a lot of the figures who left the harem, so once the harem was disbanded after Nasir Shah's assassination, a lot of the people who left it, these were very educated people. So they were actually elite in relation to the broader urban landscape of Tehran. They were also talented. They were musicians, they were singers, they were literate. So they were actually, when they went into the urban landscape, and this is kind of where my project ends, is the spanning of the harem and then the afterlife. And one of the things we know is actually a lot of these upper ranking servants fared much better than even some of the Shah's wives and descendants. So they actually rely on court patronage. So they're getting paid from the court after the court is disbanded. They're used to these lavish lives. There's a whole series of letters of complaints after Nasir Shah's death that's from his wives and children asking for back pay that they're not getting from the future monarchs that come after. So there's a whole bunch of them that are not getting paid. The high-ranking servants, they went into the urban landscape and they actually did other things. So they opened theaters, they were landowners, they became water distributors in the city. So they have a very rich history of actually becoming very elite members of the society. The other figure that I trace in the larger essay, Agha Bahram, who's an African eunuch, who is, as I said, manumitted, he actually becomes a constitutionalist. So he's actually part of the constitutional movement, fights on behalf in one of the constitutional cells. So they actually have a quite rich history that we wouldn't associate with their slave status. And that's kind of what I'm trying to point out, is the reason we haven't been seeing these historiographies, these figures in the historiographies, is because we don't follow slave narratives. We haven't until more recently. And if we did, we would see that a lot of what we think of as the urban landscape of Tehran in the early 20th century has these direct ties to the court that is disbanded. And a lot of the people in the court that go out into the city were in fact servants and formerly enslaved people. So it's actually not an oxymoron to have them be landowners. I haven't done that research. As I said, I haven't looked deeply at the land registries that Professor Tavakkoli has available at the archives. I know he has students that are working on it, and it's my goal to at some point do that, but I would not be at all surprised. And in fact, I would bet good money on it that a number of harem and court figures, including many women, would be landowners.
Actually, along that line, the very early phase of registration of property were people from the court who were registering property, and it's really extensive. And in the forefront were women who registered properties. What I like about your discussion of afterlife of the harem and how people became engaged in various professions, it reveals something that we put under servants, and that hides the highly skilled kind of things that they have. And is that high skill that they put at the service of the court now goes to public, into the market, and they cash it in.
Yeah, and I just, sorry, just to pick up on that, most of the royal descendants were educated by servants, by eunuchs specifically, because they could move between the harem and the outside world. So both for things like literacy, but also things like playing the piano or learning these kind of new modern technologies that are coming in, it was often eunuchs who would go out and learn these skills and then come back and teach it to harem women and children. So Nasir Shah's own kind of main eunuch is a African eunuch who's a significant figure and also is one of these people that ends up kind of leaving a large afterlife legacy precisely for that reason. So yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. Any other questions? If not, please join me to thank Professor Pourtavaf for this outstanding presentation, and we look forward to the publication of your book and organizing a book launch for you.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I want to thank you again for hosting the event and the series. And
our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.